Ladies and gentlemen, I am Yusrael, and this video will be looking at the 1000-day rewards for Star Trek Online subscribers. The headline for the package has to be the two Heavy Destroyer class ships, one each for the Federation, the Chimera class, and the other is the Klingon version, which is utterly unpronounceable unless you have a severe throat infection, so I'm not even going to try. Stats-wise, they are almost identical, the only differences being that the Klingon ship trades a slight chunk of shield modifier for a fully functional battle cloak, which frankly is worth it. As far as looks go, the Klingons got the better end of the deal, if you ask me. This looks very much like a Raptor that has been bulked out to cruiser standards. The wing bracings, I have to admit, remind me of nothing so much as a Thunderhawk gunship, which is fairly cool. The only niggle I have is the Uber Disruptor Weapon of Doom. Sorry, the Disruptor Lotus, to give it its proper title. Not only does having it extend out this far wreck the streamlining of it, at least in my opinion, I also have to wonder just how in blazes they're fitting it into the engineering hull. Either they've invented the folding disruptor array, or there's much less room in that ship than I initially thought. Bear in mind they've got to get 750 crew in there as well. Still, it's impressively beweaponed, it's got the sleek, no-nonsense, you are going to have a very bad day look that we so love of Klingon starships. Yeah, it's just the sheer size of that disruptor array. Yeah, well, fortunately the fix is fairly simple. If you have it come out a little less far, let me just pull up a freeze frame to give you an example. And stop the clock in 3, 2, 1, there. Yeah, you see my point? You can still see the disruptor. It still says very big gun, considering what most disruptors look like, but it's not quite so prominent, and you keep the sleek, fast, maneuverable look of the Klingon attack craft. Of course, you could argue that since this ship has a lower turn rate compared to most escorts, that perhaps it should look a little clunkier, but I don't know, that's just taking it a bit too far in my opinion. Emphasis, of course, this is simply my opinion. On to the Federation side. From an aesthetic standpoint, I have to admit that Cryptic have done something that 24 hours ago I would have considered to be utterly impossible. Indeed, 12 hours ago I would have ummed and ahed. Yes, speaking as somebody who is not a fan of the Odyssey at all, I don't like the split neck and I consider it to be an overweight bloater of a heavy cruiser. Cryptic have actually managed to make a ship that I consider to be even less attractive than that, which is a fair achievement. In fact, I'm going to go further. I'm going to say it out loud now. This is possibly the ugliest starship that I have seen in any sci-fi series for a very, very long time, and I include some of the Minmatar's worst efforts in that list. We'll start with the minor imperfections. You can see them even here at this most flattering of angles. The texturing on the buzzer collectors, I don't know whether it's the light sourcing or the reflectivity of the material they've used. You can see hints that there is something behind the textures. Look at the top right nacelle as we're seeing it here, as I just move the camera around. You can see hints there. But I don't know whether it's that the light source they're using behind each collector is too bright or the material is too reflective, but the texturing just looks like somebody slapped a flat red paint job on there and forgot to apply any kind of texture mapping. So that's my first niggle. The second one I've got is the rear third of the saucer. If you look at the ship, most of its design language is basically curves. So nacelles are curved, leading edge of the saucer is curved, leading edge of the hull, curves, 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 curves. Even the trailing edge of the pylon, which is fairly flat, you can still see a curve to it. And then you have the trailing edge of the saucer, which is curve, 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 ruler straight, bang, bang, bang. Why? My first reaction to seeing this was, 1, did Cryptic hit a polygon count limit? Or 2, did they hit a deadline? Did they have to turn around to the mesh artists and the animators and say, I don't care that it's not done, we need to get this to textures now or we're going to miss our deadline for the 1,000 days? Because my immediate thought on that is that it's unfinished. It's still at the crude, primitive Euclidean geometry stage, and yeesh, yeah, it just doesn't fit the design of the rest of the ship at all. Cryptic have had nods to that kind of trailing edge before, particularly on the Regent class. Let me find a decent picture for you, where you can see that the saucer does take a distinctly more abrupt curve on its trailing edge, but even then it's still curved. It doesn't just go straight ruler's edge cut off. So I don't know what they were thinking there. The other thing I don't particularly care for is the secondary hull. To my eye, that looks like it had about 200 Taco Bells too many over the course of a month. You could happily lose about 4 decks off that secondary hull, just so that the bottom of the keel wasn't quite so far below the bottom of the nacelles. Again, personal opinion. Similarly with the deflector, same effect. It looks as though somebody measured the width in feet and the keel depth in meters. But as with all these things, it's personal opinion, and I can't stress that enough. To my eyes, this just looks horrifically overweight, bloated, and unmanoeuvrable. And bear in mind that this is in the looker mode. The tactical mode, and if we switch it to that, gets even odder. Paradoxically, you can actually see just about the impulse exhausts on the trailing edge of the saucer, which kind of explains why they went for the flat design on the rear of the saucer. But you also have impulse exhausts on the rear of the nacelle pylons, as well as what look like exhausts here, here and here, but that can't actually exhaust rearward. Likewise, if we switch back to regenerative mode for a moment, collapse the saucer on itself, turns out the saucer drive would be exhausting straight onto the leading edge of the nacelles. You just have to wonder how the chief engineer of the prototype explained to his captain that no, they couldn't test the warp drive because when the captain had ordered full impulse, the exhaust had sheared all 4 nacelles plus most of the pylons off. That must have made for a truly interesting conversation in the design lab afterwards, or at least while they were being towed back. However, even that is not its worst offence. The worst, absolute worst offence is that whoever designed the animation, and I feel almost bad about having to take someone's work apart like this, because whoever did this clearly put some time into their animations, but they didn't think about the functionality of this deployment. Watch the rear third of the saucer here, and see if you can see what the deployment animation implies for the internals of the ship. Okay, so what happened? Well, decks 5, 6 and 7 are now decks 10, 11 and 12 with no warning whatsoever. You'll notice that we have what appears to be external hull plating here, which suggests that there is actually no way that anyone on this section of the saucer can get into the main body of the ship. Likewise on the other side. And something similar is implied for the front of the saucer as well. The escape pods here would appear to be completely unusable because the hull plating here, and yeah, that does look like solid hull, doesn't it, basically pranged straight through the internals of the saucer. Let's run that animation in reverse. Just watch what happens when this collapses. It goes in like so, and then goes the inner section of the saucer goes up 3 decks, mysteriously ignoring what appears to be solid hull plating and deck sections. So I have no idea what's going on here. Whoever designed this forgot the basic rule of starship design. Make it look cool, but it also has to look like it could work, and this does not, bluntly, look like it could work. Too many moving bits, too many odd sections, and just too many connections in the hull corridors not going where they ought to. I'm halfway inclined to suggest that there should be a 100 crew penalty every time you use this mode, purely because when you elevate a deck through 3 sections... Oh, and looking at that, it also looks like, no, they haven't quite chopped off part of the escape pods, but I wouldn't care to use any of those afterwards. But those of you who've seen Dread, remember the homeless guy who was going to get 3 weeks in the ISO cubes until that blast door landed on him? Yeah. I'm kind of thinking something similar is going to happen to quite a lot of red shirts every single time you trigger this transformation sequence. It's a pity, really. If the nacelles were permanently folded down, then this secondary hull wouldn't look quite so bloated, for one thing. The saucer exhausts would make considerably more sense, and the whole thing generally wouldn't look quite so bad. I also have to query the 240-degree arc on the phaser lotus based on this model, because looking at it from straight astern, you've got clear lines of sight to the emitters, likewise coming around onto the port and starboard quarters, dead ahead, looping round. In fact, the only point where the emitter isn't going to have line of fire to you somehow is if you're at more than, well, about 50, 60 degrees elevation or declination relative to the ship. So the weapon arc that they've picked for the Phaser Lotus makes absolutely no sense compared to the model. The real problem with the Chimera, however, and its Klingon counterpart, isn't the aesthetics. That is purely a matter of personal taste. And if I happen to regard it as the ugliest starship ever built, well, I'm sure there is somebody who would disagree with me violently and vehemently. The real problem is that, unlike the Z-Store, which at least maintains the fig leaf of not being pay to win, in that you can grind up dilithium and at least spend someone else's cash to get an advantage, this is explicitly pay to win. There is no other way to get this ship other than spending a large quantity of your own money. Right, the reason for it is the Phaser Lotus. Leaving aside the fact that this is the most flexible escort design yet fielded, particularly with these Lieutenant Commander and Ensign Universal stations, the Phaser Lotus is fairly outrageous. Oh, the basic console's innocuous enough. 723 damage times 8 pulses, up to 3 targets per pulse. I mean, how offensive could that be? Well, if you add in 125 weapon power and a variety of phaser relay consoles, and cap out your weapon skills, then it gets a little more painful. Bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that a couple of those tactical consoles aren't top of the line. You could probably edge 2,500 damage per target per pulse. And if you were thinking that that 2,400 damage is split between 3 targets, no it isn't. It's 2,500 damage per target per pulse, so potentially you are looking at 60,000 damage from a single firing of this weapon. And if you really don't believe me, if you think I'm somehow getting my maths wrong, here's a video of the weapon being fired in slow motion. Count the number of damage entries in the log. Oh yes, and to further add to the horror, not only can the phaser lotus score critical hits, but I wasn't using any attack patterns during that firing sequence, so you can rack up the potential damage even further with a fair amount of ease, which frankly gets into truly scary territory if you then imagine 5 destroyers operating as a coordinated team in a 5v5 arena. Yeah, the PvP scene needed yet another balance problem. So, let's summarise. Should you get a lifetime subscription? Well, that comes down to 3 questions. 1. Do you want a gold subscription? Do the benefits offered appeal to you over silver? 2. Do you have the money, currently $200, but it will eventually go back up to $300, to pay for the lifetime sub up front? And 3. Do you intend to be playing this game regularly for, at the moment, 14 months, and once the sale ends, 21 months? Because those are the break-even points, for want of a better term. Actually, in both occasions, you'll be slightly ahead of the game by a few dollars, compared to a regular gold subscriber. If that's the case, ladies and gentlemen, then buy your lifetime sub today. You will get all the veteran rewards, of course. You will eventually have the satisfaction of being ahead of your gold subscriber colleagues. Oh yes, and you'll get 2 of the most ludicrously powerful starships in the game right now. By way of a postscript, I will just note that this is the latest step in a slightly disturbing trend that's been coming out of Cryptic in recent months. There's always been an in-game store in Star Trek Online, and there's always been an element of pay-to-win inherent in it. This goes right the way back to the Excelsior, which used to be the only Federation cruiser with a Lieutenant Commander tactical slot, and the Nebula, which was the first Starfleet vessel to feature a Universal Bridge Officer. I think it was a Lieutenant. Back in the day, this was a fairly major deal, less so now, of course. For a while, it was getting less blatant. The dilithium store ensured that at least you could spend someone else's money, but with the lockboxes, particularly the temporal lockbox, and now the heavy destroyers, I'm starting to wonder if Cryptic are swinging too far towards being blatant about pay to win. It's their product, of course, and they've got both a right and a duty to make a profit out of it, but I can't help but wonder if they'd make more money in the long run by not being quite so blatant. I'll see you next time.